The engine coughed twice at 14,000 feet. Then it died. Not a sputter, not a gradual loss of power, a clean, absolute silence that filled the cockpit like a held breath. One moment James Whitfield could feel the Cessna 206 vibrating through his seat, through his hands on the yoke, through the soles of his boots on the rudder pedals. The next moment, nothing. Just wind against the fuselage and the vast, bone-colored emptiness of the Sahara stretching in every direction below him. James Whitfield, 34, British charter pilot based out of Algiers, flying a medical supply run to a mining outpost near Tamanrasset. 1,200 kilometers of open desert. He had made this run 6 times before. He knew the route the way a taxi driver knows the road to the airport, automatic, mechanical, almost boring. But boring ended at 14:47 local time when the fuel line failed and the Continental engine went silent over a landscape with no roads, no structures, and no life for 160 kilometers in any direction. He had maybe 90 seconds to find a landing spot. The ground below was red, hard, flat, gravel plain with scattered rocks. Not sand dunes. That was the only mercy. He dropped the nose to maintain airspeed, trimmed for best glide, and scanned the terrain ahead. There. A stretch of lighter ground, relatively smooth, maybe 400 meters long. It would have to do. He came in steep, flared late, and the Cessna hit the gravel at 70 knots. The impact threw him forward against the harness. The nose gear collapsed on the first bounce. The propeller dug into the ground and snapped. The aircraft skidded sideways, tipping onto its left wing before slamming to a stop in a cloud of dust and silence. Whitfield sat in the cockpit for a full minute, breathing. His forehead was bleeding from a gash where it struck the instrument panel. His left wrist throbbed, sprained, not broken. He could move his fingers. He could move his legs. He was alive. Outside the cracked windshield, the Sahara waited. It was 2 in the afternoon. The temperature was 51 degrees Celsius. He had 1 liter of water in a bottle behind his seat, half a sandwich from that morning, and a first aid kit designed for minor cuts, not desert survival. The radio was dead. The emergency locator transmitter, the ELT mounted in the tail, he could not tell if it had activated on impact. It was supposed to trigger automatically. He had no way to check. He climbed out of the aircraft and stood in the heat. It hit him like something physical, not air but a wall, a weight. The sun was not overhead, it was everywhere. It radiated off the gravel, off the white fuselage, off the rocks. Within 30 seconds, sweat was running down his back. Within 2 minutes, that sweat was already evaporating. He could feel his body losing water in real time, an invisible bleeding. 4 liters a day. That is what the desert takes from a human body at this temperature. He had 1 liter for a situation that demanded 16. First things first. He needed shade. The Cessna's right wing was still intact, angled slightly upward from the tilted fuselage. It cast a shadow roughly 2 meters wide. He pulled the seat cushion from the cockpit, set it in the shadow, and sat down. Then he opened the first aid kit and cleaned the cut on his forehead. 8 butterfly strips to close the wound. It would scar. He did not care about scars. He cared about water. He rationed the bottle in his mind. 4 sips today, small ones, just enough to wet his mouth and throat. For tomorrow. If rescue came within 48 hours, he could survive. The ELT signal, if it was transmitting, would give searchers his approximate position. Someone at the charter company in Algiers would notice when he failed to arrive in Tamanrasset by evening. A search would be organized. 48 hours. Maybe 72. He could stretch 1 liter across 3 days if he stayed still, stayed in the shade, and did not panic. He did not panic. Not on the first day. The first day was logic, procedure, training. He arranged a signal pattern on the gravel. Rocks laid out in a giant X, 20 meters across, visible from the air. He tied a strip of orange fabric from the first aid kit to the tail of the Cessna. He checked the ELT housing. The antenna looked intact. He could not confirm transmission, but the housing was undamaged. He ate half the sandwich at sunset, when the temperature dropped to 38 degrees, and allowed himself 2 small sips of water. The sky turned orange, then purple, then black. Stars appeared. More stars than he had ever seen. The silence was absolute. Not quiet. Silent. No wind, no insects, no distant engine hum. The only sound was his own breathing and the faint tick of the cooling aircraft metal. On the second morning, he woke at dawn to find his tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth. It took 3 attempts to separate them. He had slept under the wing, on the seat cushion, and despite the cold of the desert night, the temperature had dropped to 9 degrees. He had sweated through his shirt. The body does not stop losing moisture. Even in sleep. Even in cold. He took 1 sip of water. He estimated 5 sips remained. Maybe 6 if he kept them small. At 10:14 a.m., he heard it. A low drone, far to the north. An aircraft. He scrambled out from under the wing and looked up, shielding his eyes. There, a speck moving east to west, maybe 10 kilometers away. Too far. He waved both arms. He screamed. The sound of his own voice shocked him. A dry rasp that barely carried 10 feet. The speck continued east. It did not turn. It did not circle. It disappeared behind the shimmer of the heat haze, and the silence returned. James Whitfield stood in 50-degree heat with his arms above his head, watching the empty sky, and understood something that changed everything. They were not looking here. The search, if there was one, was following the wrong route. He was off course. The fuel line had failed early, and he had been drifting south on the wind for 20 minutes before the engine quit. His actual position could be 40 or 50 kilometers south of where they expected him to be. He sat back under the wing and stared at the water bottle. 4 sips left. No one was coming. Not here. Not to this exact point in a gravel desert that looked identical to every other point for 100 kilometers. If he stayed with the aircraft, he would die under this wing within 3 days. If he walked, he would die faster, but there was a chance, a small one, that he could reach the Trans-Saharan track. He had studied the map before takeoff. The track ran roughly north-south, maybe 140 kilometers to the west. At night, walking in the cool hours, he could cover 15 to 20 kilometers. 7 nights. He had water for maybe 1. He decided to walk. He waited until 5 p.m., when the shadows grew long and the temperature dropped below 40. He took the water bottle, the first aid kit, the seat cushion for insulation, the strip of orange fabric, and his watch. He checked his compass, the small one on his keychain, not aviation grade, but functional. West. He needed to go west. He took 1 sip of water, soaked a strip of fabric from the first aid kit, and wrapped it around his neck, and started walking. The first night, he covered what he estimated to be 18 kilometers. The gravel plain was flat and relatively easy to walk on, though every step sent small shocks through his sprained left wrist from the impact of swinging arms. The stars were navigation enough. Polaris to his right, the Southern Cross low on the horizon behind him. He walked until the sky began to lighten in the east, then found a shallow depression in the ground, draped the seat cushion over his head and shoulders, and tried to sleep. Day 3. The water was gone. He had taken his last sip at dawn, a mouthful that was more psychological than physical. His body absorbed it before it reached his stomach. Now the real countdown began. Without water, at this temperature, the human body begins to shut down in stages. First the mouth dries completely. Then the throat closes, making swallowing painful. Then the headaches start, brutal, pounding pressure behind the eyes. Then the muscles begin to cramp as electrolytes deplete. Then the kidneys slow. Then the mind begins to fracture. Hallucinations. Confusion. A strange, almost peaceful acceptance that feels like clarity, but is actually the brain shutting off its alarm systems one by one. He knew all of this. He had read survival manuals. Knowing it did not make it easier. Knowing it made it worse, because he could feel each stage arriving on schedule, like stops on a terrible train. By the afternoon of day 3, his urine had turned dark amber. He urinated into the empty water bottle. He knew the textbooks said not to drink it. He also knew the textbooks were written by people who had never been alone in the Sahara with 0 water and 120 kilometers still to walk. He drank half. It was warm and bitter, and his stomach tried to reject it immediately. He forced it to stay. On the 4th night, he found something that saved his life. A dry riverbed, a wadi, cut into the gravel plain, maybe 3 meters wide and 1 meter deep. Wadis meant water had flowed here at some point. Where there was a wadi, there might be moisture trapped beneath the surface. He dropped to his knees and began to dig with his hands. The gravel was loose at first, then compacted. At maybe 40 centimeters, the ground felt cooler. At 60 centimeters, his fingers touched something that was not quite wet but not quite dry either, damp sand, dark with trapped moisture. He scooped handfuls of it, and pressed them against his face, his neck, his wrists. Then he packed the damp sand into the orange fabric strip, twisted it tight, and held it over his mouth. He breathed through the fabric. The air tasted like mud and minerals, and he had never tasted anything so beautiful. He squeezed. A few drops, brown, gritty, barely liquid, fell onto his tongue. He spent the next 2 hours wringing moisture from the desert floor, one excruciating drop at a time. He estimated he collected maybe 1/4 of a cup. Day 5. Day 6. The days blurred. He walked at night, and buried himself in sand during the day, leaving only his face exposed, the seat cushion shading his head. The sand was cooler beneath the surface, 35 degrees instead of 60 on top. He found another wadi on day 6, and repeated the digging ritual. This time the moisture was deeper but more abundant. He collected nearly half a cup. He also found a beetle, large, black, alive. He ate it. It crunched between his teeth and tasted like dust and salt. He found 3 more. He ate those too. Protein. Moisture. Anything. His weight was dropping visibly. His flight suit hung loose. His cheekbones had become sharp ridges under papery skin. The headaches had moved from behind his eyes to the base of his skull, a constant, low-grade pounding that never stopped. His vision blurred at the edges. Twice on the 6th night he saw lights in the distance, orange, flickering, like campfires. Both times he walked toward them. Both times they vanished. Mirages do not only happen in daylight. The brain, desperate for hope, manufactures them in darkness too. On the 7th day, he stopped walking. Not because he chose to. His legs simply refused. The muscles in his calves had seized into knots so tight he could feel individual fibers pulling apart. He lay in the sand and looked at the sky and thought about his daughter. She was 4. Her name was Lily. She had asked him before this flight if he was going to fly over the moon. He had told her no, just over the sand. She had said the sand was boring. He had laughed. Now he lay on the sand and it was not boring. It was infinite and indifferent, and it wanted to absorb him into itself, to flatten him into another layer of gravel that would bake under the sun for 1,000 years until someone found his bones and wondered who he was. He did not stop. That is the part of this story that matters. He did not stop. He lay there for 11 minutes, he counted, and then he rolled onto his stomach, pulled his knees under his chest, and crawled. West. Always west. On the 8th night, the gravel changed. It became sandier, softer. There were small tufts of dry grass, the first vegetation he had seen in 6 days. Grass meant roots. Roots meant water somewhere below. He was close to something. He did not know what. But the desert was changing, and change meant a boundary, and boundaries meant life. On the 9th morning, he heard bells. Small, metallic, irregular. He thought it was another hallucination. He had been hearing things for 2 days, his daughter's voice, engine sounds, music. But this sound did not fade when he turned his head. It grew louder. He crawled over a low rise and looked down into a shallow valley and saw them. Goats. 11 goats moving slowly through the scrub, and behind them, a boy. Maybe 12 years old. A stick in one hand. A plastic jug of water hanging from a rope over his shoulder. The boy saw him and froze. A creature rising from the desert floor, burned black by the sun, lips split open, eyes swollen nearly shut, crawling on hands and knees in a shredded flight suit. James Whitfield tried to speak. Nothing came out. He raised one hand, not waving, just holding it open. The universal gesture. I am not a threat. I need help. I am a person. The boy ran. Not away. Toward him. He unscrewed the cap of the plastic jug and knelt beside the crawling man and poured water over his face, into his mouth, across his cracked and bleeding hands. The water was warm and tasted like plastic and dust, and it was the finest thing James Whitfield had ever tasted in his life. He had walked 206 kilometers in 9 days. He weighed 51 kilograms, down from 83. His kidneys were failing. His liver was damaged. His corneas were burned. He spent 19 days in a hospital in Tamanrasset before he could stand without assistance. The doctors told him he should not have survived past day 4. They used the word, impossible, 3 times during the briefing with the British consul. 6 months later, Whitfield returned to flying. He requested the same route. The Cessna's wreckage is still out there. GPS coordinates logged by the search team that found it 2 weeks after the rescue. Nobody has gone back to retrieve it. It sits on the gravel plain, nose buried, left wing crumpled, an orange strip of fabric still tied to the tail, faded now, almost white, snapping in a wind that never stops. This story is based on real events. Some details, dialogue, and scenes have been dramatized for narrative purposes.